Okay, this is the Westworld Command Center React application assignment. If you haven't seen the series, it's based on the HBO series Westworld. It's not a problem if you haven't seen it though. The idea is that we have these hosts, they're kind of like robots. They are robots, I should say. And we have a park, and guests can come into the park and interact with these robots. They're all dressed up like Wild Wild West figures, and they have different areas of the park that they're in. So we're going to create an application to deploy them to these different areas, set their status, etc. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to clone it down. I've already done that, but once you clone it down from the repo, we're going to start the server. So we have this JSON server that we're going to run. Don't forget to do npm install, by the way. But once you do, JSON server --watch db.json. So this is all going to be based on a db.json file that we have in our repo. And I'm going to run it on port 4000. So we have these two endpoints that we're given. They're both GET requests. They are not posts or patches. Don't have to worry about that. We have this host endpoint and this areas endpoint. I'll explain what those two mean in a second. Cool. As for the actual React application, npm start after you npm installed. And this is a finished example of it. Once it loads up here, just give it a second. All right, here we go. So this is what it should look like when you're finished. You'll notice these areas here, these red areas. This is going to come, the names and where they actually should be positioned is going to come from the areas endpoint. You're going to use the name that you're given as the class name, and that'll automatically position them where they need to be, so you don't have to worry about styling. You don't have to worry about the border either. It's all going to be styled for you. And then down here we have our hosts. So you can see that when I click on a host, it selects it red with a red border. If I click on a different host, it deselects the first one and selects the next one. You'll also notice that when I click on a host, I see their information here. So we get their name, we get their gender icon, whether they're decommissioned or activated, what their current area is. So now, one thing to note is that I can change their area. It does ignore this log panel for now. I'll explain that in a second. But when I change their area, it does actually change in the dropdown, but nothing actually happens. That's because they're currently decommissioned. When a host is decommissioned, it's automatically brought back to cold storage. So this guy is in Korea. I can change into high plains, nothing happens. However, once I toggle his activate toggle, you'll notice that first of all, he gets switched between from decommissioned to active. And second of all, he gets put directly into the area that is selected in the current area dropdown. I can also change it now, so I can move him around to different areas of the park. Once I click back to another host, notice that their status is now reflected. So Peter's decommissioned. So if I click on Lawrence, he's active, so that's going to say active. It's going to be toggled. Click on Peter, he's decommissioned, so it's going to be toggled off. All right, another thing to note is that there are limits to each area. And that's going to come from our endpoint, from our area's endpoint. There's a little integer for each, called limit for each area. And so, for example, Lowlands has a 6-host limit. Whether they're actually active or in cold storage, selecting that particular area counts towards that limit. So, for example, let's see, we got 1, 2, and I think 3. So there's 3 people currently selected as Lowlands. So if I add 3 more people, that's the max I can add. So what should actually happen is let's actually add her to Lowlands, add her to Lowlands, and you should see an error eventually. Yep, there we go. Error, too many hosts cannot add Peter to Lowlands. What this means is that if I was to activate, you'll notice that Peter, who I tried to add to Lowlands, his current area stayed the way it was before, which is Badlands, and everybody who was in Lowlands gets pushed into that area. So have to somehow figure out how to limit. And this should, be the case if they're active as well. So for example, I try to Move Maeve to Lowlands, and nothing happens. I get an error message, and she stays exactly where she was. Cool. All right, let's move on to the what's next here. Move on to the log panel here. So the log panel is going to be built for you, but making sure that it gets the right information is going to be up to you. Notice that, for example, a couple things to note. There's going to be three different types of logs, by the way. There's going to be a notify, error, and a warn, and they have different color schemes. So you'll see warn is orange, error is red, notify is black. They're time stamped. That should be given to you via a services file, which I'll explain in a second. But, so if I move somebody, that's just a notify. That's not something to freak out about, right? But if I activate them, we're going to want to know that. We're going to want to like let our other coworkers know, for example, that, hey, I'm moving this guy onto the park. It's a big deal. So I get a warn for that. And like we saw before, if I try to add too many people to an area, it's going to reject it and give me an error. Another thing to note about that is that the errors, the latest error is going to be at the top. The last or the first error is going to be at the bottom. So you have to figure out how to make sure you get that ordering correct. Other than that, we also have this decommission all and activate all button, which you've seen. One thing to note is that that should correspond, or all the hosts should be accurately showing their decommissioned and active status, even if I activate all of them or decommission all of them. So for example, Teddy is decommissioned. If I activate all of them, he is now active because he's one of the hosts that have become active. I can selectively, decommission a couple of them, but because I activated all of them, I should have to click the decommission all to bring them all back in. And as you can see, this should change. It should be green when I've clicked it. So now the next option is to decommission all, and then I can activate them all. And it should be red if they have not been all activated.